He writes that sources say Reid could use a tactic known as the nuclear option to change the Senate rules with a majority vote. We do expect to hear from the Majority Leader. In fact, he is at his seat. Live coverage now here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, retired Admiral Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Lord God, the giver of every good and perfect gift, during this Thanksgiving season, we lift grateful hearts to you in prayer. Thank you for the splash of raindrops, for the warmth of sunshine, for the melody of the moonlight, and for the stars that hang like scintillating lanterns in the night. Lord, we're grateful for strength to meet life's challenges, for the fulfillment of honorable labor, for friendships that dispel loneliness, for the laughter of children, and for the joy of the harvest. We praise you for the privilege to receive your forgiveness and to make operative your redeeming grace in our thoughts, desires, and hopes. We also express gratitude for our senators who have an opportunity to participate in history's great events and to serve your purposes for their lives in this generation. Lord of all, to you we raise this our prayer of grateful praise. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to count number 243, S. 1356, the Workforce Investment Act.
The Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reid, moves to proceed to calendar number 243, S. 1356, a bill to amend the Workforce Investment Act of 1998, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Mr. President, following my remarks and those of the Republican leader, the Senate will resume consideration of the National Defense Authorization Act. I filed cloture on that last night. As a result, the filing deadline for first-degree amendments to the bill is 1 p.m. today. Mr. President, I'm told that S. 1752 is due for a second reading.
The Clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S. 1752, a bill to reform procedures for determinations to proceed to trial by court-martial for certain offenses under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and for other purposes.
I would object to any further proceedings to this.
Objection is heard. The bill will be placed on the calendar. And under the previous,
I'm sorry.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I'm a strong supporter of our Iran sanctions regime and believe that the current sanctions have brought Iran to the negotiating table. I believe we must do everything possible to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons capability, which would threaten Israel and the national security of our great country. The Obama administration is in the midst of negotiations with Iranians that is designed to end their nuclear weapons program. We all strongly support those negotiations and hope they will succeed and want them to produce the strongest possible agreement. However, Mr. President, we're also aware of the possibility that the Iranians could keep the negotiations from succeeding. I hope that won't happen. But the Senate must be prepared to move forward with a new bipartisan Iran sanctions bill when the Senate returns after the Thanksgiving recess. I'm committed to do just that. A number of senators, Democrats and Republicans, have offered their own amendments on Iran, and they've done a couple of amendments in the Defense Authorization Bill. And I know that other senators also have their own sanctions bills that they would like to move forward. I will support a bill that would broaden the scope of our current petroleum sanctions, place limitations on trade with strategic sectors of the Iranian economy that support its nuclear ambitions, as well as pursue those who divert goods to Iran. While I support the administration's diplomatic efforts, I believe we need to leave our legislative options open to act on a new bipartisan sanctions bill in December, shortly after we return. Mr. President, I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The U.S. Senate gaveling in, still in leader time. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid conferring there on the floor with Mitch McConnell, his Republican counterpart. We heard about Iran sanctions. The Majority Leader mentioned yesterday filing that motion to limit debate on the Defense Authorization Bill, which is the pending legislation before the Senate. But it's possible, in fact, it seems likely now, we'll hear something about moving forward with nominations and the Senate filibuster. CQ writes this morning that a senior Democratic aide said that Reid would, quote, probably pull the trigger today on the so-called nuclear option. The change would affect executive and judicial nominees, but exempt Supreme Court nominees. Humberto Sanchez writing that two other Democratic aides also said it was looking likely that Reid would act unless a last-minute deal can be struck, which seems unlikely.
Majority Leader.
That the call of quorum be terminated.
Without objections, ordered. The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the American people believe Congress is broken. The American people believe the Senate is broken. And I believe the American people are right. During this Congress, the 113th Congress, the United States has wasted an unprecedented amount of time on procedural hurdles and partisan obstruction. As a result, the work of this country goes undone. Congress should be passing legislation that strengthens our economy, protects American families. Instead, we're burning wasted hours and wasted days between filibusters. I could say, instead, we're burning wasted days and wasted weeks between filibusters. Even one of the Senate's most basic duties, confirmation of presidential nominees, has become completely unworkable. Mr. President, there has been unbelievable, unprecedented obstruction. For the first time in the history of our republic, Republicans have routinely used the filibuster to prevent President Obama from appointing an executive team or confirming judges. It's truly a troubling trend that Republicans are willing to block executive branch nominations even when they have no objection to the qualifications of the nominee. Instead, they block qualified executive branch nominees to circumvent the legislative process. They block qualified executive branch nominations to force wholesale changes to laws. They block qualified executive branch nominees to restructure entire executive branch departments. And they block qualified judicial nominees because they don't want President Obama to appoint any judges to certain courts. The need for change is so very obvious. It's clearly visible. It's manifest. We have to do something to change things. In the history of our country, some 230-plus years, there have been 168 filibusters of executive and judicial nominations. Half of them have occurred during the Obama administration. Mr. President, 230 plus years, 50%. 4.5 years, 50%. Is there anything fair about that? These nominees deserve at least an up or down vote, yes or no. But Republican filibusters deny them a fair vote, any vote, and deny the President his team. Gridlock has consequences, and they're terrible. It's not only bad for President Obama, bad for this body, the United States Senate. It's bad for our country. It's bad for our national security and bad for our economic security. That's why it's time to get the Senate working again, not for the good of the current Democratic majority or some future Republican majority, but for the good of the United States of America. It's time to change. It's time to change the Senate before this institution becomes obsolete. Mr. President, at the beginning of this Congress, the Republican leader pledged that, and I quote, "This Congress should be more bipartisan than the last Congress." Mr. President, we're told in Scripture. Let's take, for example, Old Testament, Book of Numbers. Promises, pledges, a vow, one must not break his word. In January, Republicans promised to work with the majority to process nominations in a timely manner by unanimous consent, except in extraordinary circumstances. Mr. President, exactly 3 weeks later, Republicans mounted a first-in-history filibuster of a highly qualified nominee for Secretary of Defense. Despite being a former Republican senator, a decorated war hero, having saved his brother's life in Vietnam, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel's nomination was pending in the Senate for a record 34 days, more than 3 times the previous average of a Secretary of Defense. Remember, Mr. President, our country was at war. Republicans have blocked executive nominees like Secretary Hagel, not because they object to their qualifications, but simply because they seek to undermine the very government in which they were elected to serve. Take the nomination of Richard Cordray to lead the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There was no doubt about his ability to do the job. But the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren, went for more than 2 years without a leader because Republicans refused to accept the law of the land, because they wanted to roll back a law that protects consumers from the greed of Wall Street. So I say to my Republican colleagues, you don't have to like the laws of the land, but you do have to respect those laws and acknowledge them and abide by them. Similar obstruction continued unabated for 7 more months until Democrats threatened to change Senate rules to allow up or down votes on executive nominations. In July, after obstructing dozens of executive nominees for months and some for years, Republicans once again promised they would end the unprecedented obstruction. One look at the Senate's executive calendar shows that nothing has changed since July. Republicans have continued their record of obstruction if no agreement had ever been reached. Republicans have continued their record of obstruction as if no agreement had been reached. There are currently 75 executive branch nominations ready to be confirmed by the Senate that have been waiting an average of 140 days for confirmation. One executive nominee to the agency that safeguards the water that my children and my grandchildren drink and the air they breathe has waited almost 900 days for confirmation. We agreed in July that the Senate should be confirming nominees to ensure the proper functioning of government. Consistent and unprecedented obstruction by the Republican caucus has turned advise and consent into deny and obstruct. In addition to filibustering a nominee for Secretary of Defense for the first time in history, Senate Republicans also blocked a sitting member of Congress from an administration position for the first time since 1843. As a senior member of the House Financial Service Committee, Congressman Mel Watt's understanding of the mistakes that led to the housing crisis made him uniquely qualified to serve as administrator of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Senate Republicans simply don't like the consumer protections Congressman Watt was nominated to develop and implement. So they denied a fellow member of Congress and a graduate of the Yale School of Law even the courtesy of an up or down vote. Mr. President, in the last 3 weeks alone, Republicans have blocked up or down votes on 3 highly qualified nominees to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. This doesn't take into consideration they twice turned down one of the most qualified people in my 30 years in the Senate that I've ever seen come before this body, Caitlin Halligan. So we got 3 more to add to that list. The D.C. Circuit is considered by many to be the highest court of the land, and some think maybe the most important. It deals with these complex cases that come from federal agencies and other things within their jurisdiction. Republicans have blocked 4 of President Obama's 5 nominees to the D.C. Circuit, whereas Democrats approved 4 of President Bush's 6 nominations to this important court. Today, the D.C. Circuit Court, at least the second most important court in the land, has more than 25% in vacancies. There isn't a single, Mr. President, I ask order. There's a conversation over here that's quite distracting.
The Senate will be in order. The
Thank you.
Senator has the right to be heard.
Mr. President, there isn't a single legitimate objection to the qualifications of any of these nominees to the D.C. Circuit that President Obama has put forward. Republicans refuse to give them up or down vote, a simple yes or no vote. Republicans simply don't want President Obama to make any appointments at all to this vital court. None. 0. Further, only 23 district court nominations have been filibustered in the entire history of our country. 23. You know what? 20 of them have been in the last 4.5 years. 230 plus years. 3. Last 4.5 years. 20. That's not fair. With 1 out of every 10 federal judgeships vacant, millions of Americans who rely on courts that are overworked and understaffed are being denied the justice they rightly deserve. Mr. President, more than half of the nation's population lives in parts of the country that have been declared a judicial emergency. No one has worked harder than the presiding officer to move judges. Presiding officer is the chairman also of the Judiciary Committee. No one knows the problem more than the presiding officer. Mr. President, the American people are fed up with this kind of obstruction and gridlock. The American people, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, are fed up with this gridlock, this obstruction. The American people want Washington to work for American families once again. Mr. President, I'm on their side, which is why I propose an important change to the rules of the United States Senate. The present Republican leader himself said, and this is a direct quote, "The Senate has repeatedly changed its rules as circumstances dictate," close quote. He's right. In fact, the Senate has changed its rules 18 times by sustaining or overturning the ruling of presiding officer in the last 36 years, during the tenures of both Republican and Democratic majorities. The change we propose today would ensure executive and judicial nominations an up or down vote on confirmation. Yes, no. The rule change will make cloture for all nominations other than the Supreme Court a majority threshold vote, yes or no. The Senate is a living thing, and to survive it must change, as it has over the history of this great country. To the average American, adapting the rules to make the Senate work again is just common sense. This is not about Democrats versus Republicans. This is about making Washington work regardless of who's in the White House or who controls the Senate. To remain relevant and effective as an institution, the Senate must evolve to meet the challenges of this modern era. I have no doubt my Republican colleagues will argue the fault is ours. It's the Democrats' fault. I can say from experience that no one's hands are entirely clean on this issue. But today the important distinction is not between Democrats and Republicans. It's between those who are willing to help break the gridlock in Washington and those who defend the status quo. Is the Senate working now? Can anyone say the Senate is working now? I don't think so. Today, Democrats and independents are saying enough is enough. To change the rules regarding presidential nominees will apply equally to both parties. When Republicans are in power, these changes will apply to them just as well. That, Mr. President, is simple fairness. And it's something both sides should be willing to live with to make Washington work again. That's simple fairness. Note the absence of quorum.
And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid on the floor in his opening comments proposing a change in Senate rules for executive and judicial nominations.
I ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Over the past several weeks, the American people have been witness to one of the most breathtaking indictments of big government liberalism in memory. And I'm not just talking about a website. I'm talking about the way in which Obamacare was forced on the public by an administration and a Democratic-led Congress that we now know was willing to do and say anything to pass the law. The President and his Democratic allies were so determined to force their vision of health care on the public that they assured them up and down that they wouldn't lose the plans they had, that they'd save money instead of losing it, and that they'd be able to use the doctors and hospitals they were already using. But of course we know that that rhetoric just doesn't match reality. And the stories we're hearing on a nearly daily basis now range from heartbreaking to comic. Just yesterday I saw a story about a guy getting a letter in the mail saying his dog had qualified for insurance under Obamacare. So yeah, I'd probably be running for the exit too if I'd supported this law. I'd be looking to change the subject. Change the subject. Just as Senate Democrats have been doing with their threats of going nuclear and changing the Senate rules on nominations. If I were a senator from Oregon, for example, which hasn't enrolled a single person for the Obamacare exchange, I'd probably want to talk about something else too. But here's the problem with this latest distraction. It doesn't distract people from Obamacare, it reminds them of Obamacare. It reminds them of all the broken promises. It reminds them of the power grab. It reminds them of the way Democrats set up one set of rules for themselves and another for everybody else. One set of rules for them and another for everybody else. Actually, this is all basically the same debate. And rather than distract people from Obamacare, it only reinforces the narrative of a party that is willing to do and say just about anything to get its way. Willing to do or say just about anything to get its way. Because that's just what they're doing all over again. Once again, Senate Democrats are threatening to break the rules of the Senate, in order to change the rules of the Senate. And over what? Over what? Over a court that doesn't even have enough work to do? Millions of Americans are hurting because of a law Washington Democrats forced upon them. And what do they do about it? They cook up some fake fight over judges, a fake fight over judges that aren't even needed. Look, I get it. As I indicated, I want to be talking about something else, too, if I had to defend dogs getting insurance while millions of Americans lost theirs. But it won't work. And the parallels between this latest skirmish and the original Obamacare push are just too obvious to ignore. Think about it. Just think about it. The majority leader promised, he promised, over and over again, that he wouldn't break the rules of the Senate in order to change them. This was not an ancient promise. July the 14th, on Meet the Press, he said, we're not touching judges. This year, July 14th, Meet the Press, we're not touching judges. Then there are the double standards. When Democrats were in the minority, they argued strenuously for the very thing they now say we will have to do without, namely the right to extended debate on lifetime appointments. In other words, they believe that one set of rules should apply to them, and another set to everybody else. He may have just as well have said, if you like the rules of the Senate, you can keep them. Huh? If you like the rules of the Senate, you can keep them. Just the way so many Democrats in the administration and Congress now believe that Obamacare is good enough for their constituents, but then when it comes to them, their political allies, their staffs, well, of course, that's different. And let's not forget about the raw power at play here. On this point, the similarities between the Obamacare debate and the Democratic threat to go nuclear on nominations are inescapable. Inescapable. They muscled through Obamacare on a party line vote and didn't care about the views of the minority. Didn't care one whit about the views of the minority. And that's just about what they're going to do here. The American people decided to give the Democrats, not to give the Democrats the House, or to restore a filibuster-proof majority they had in the Senate back in 2009. And our Democratic colleagues don't like that one bit. They just don't like it. The American people are getting in the way of what they'd like to do. So they're trying to change the rules of the game to get their way anyway. They said so themselves. Earlier this year, the senior senator from New York said they want to fill up the D.C. circuit one way or the other. Fill up the D.C. circuit one way or the other. And the reason is clear. As one liberal activist put it earlier this year, President Obama's agenda runs through the D.C. circuit. Can't get what you want through the Congress because the American people in November 2010 said they'd had enough. They issued a national restraining order after watching 2 years of this administration unrestrained. So now their agenda runs through the bureaucracy and through the D.C. circuit. As I said, in short, unlike the first 2 years of the Obama administration, there's now a legislative check on the president. And the administration doesn't much like checks and balances. So it wants to circumvent the people's representatives with an aggressive regulatory agenda. And our Democratic colleagues want to facilitate that by filling up a court that will rule on his agenda. A court that doesn't even have enough work to do, especially if it means changing the subject from Obamacare for a few days. And get this, they think they can change the rules of the Senate in a way that benefits only them. They want to do it in such a way that President Obama's agenda gets enacted, but that a future Republican president couldn't get his or her picks for the Supreme Court confirmed by a Republican Senate using the same precedent our Democratic friends want to set. So they want to have it both ways. But this sort of gerrymandered vision of the nuclear option is really just wishful thinking. As the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Grassman, pointed out yesterday, the majority leader changes the rules for some judicial nominees. He's effectively changing them for all judicial nominees, including the Supreme Court, as Senator Grassley pointed out just yesterday. So look, I realize this sort of wishful thinking might appeal to the uninitiated newcomers in the Democratic Conference who've served exactly 0 days in the minority. But the rest of you guys in the conference should know better. Those of you who've been in the minority before should know better. Let's remember how we got here. Let's remember that it was Senate Democrats who literally pioneered the practice of filibustering circuit court nominees, and who've been its biggest proponents in the very recent past. After President Bush was elected, they even held a retreat in which they discussed the need to change the ground rules by which lifetime appointments are considered. The senior senator from New York put on a seminar, invited Lawrence Tribe, Cass Sunstein. In the past, the practice had been neither side had filibustered circuit court nominees. Now, in fact, I can remember at Senator Lott's insistence, gagging several times and voting cloture on circuit judges to the Ninth Circuit, knowing full well that once cloture was invoked, they'd be confirmed. So this business of filibustering circuit court judges was entirely an invention of the guys over here on the other side, the ones you're looking at right over here. They made it up. They started it, and this is where we ended up. After President Bush was elected, they held this retreat that I was just talking about. They made a big deal about it. It was all a prelude to what followed: the serial filibustering of several of President Bush's circuit court nominees, including Miguel Estrada, whose nomination to the D.C. Circuit was filibustered by Senate Democrats a record 7 times. 7 times. And now they want to blow up the rules because Republicans are following a precedent they themselves set. And I might add, we're following that precedent in a much more modest way than Democrats did. So how about this for a suggestion? How about instead of picking a fight with Senate Republicans by jamming through nominees to a court that doesn't even have enough work to do, how about taking yes for an answer and working with us on filling judicial emergencies that actually exist? Yet rather than learn from past precedents on judicial nominations that they themselves set, Democrats now want to set another one. Now, I have no doubt that if they do, they will come to regret that one as well. Our colleagues, evidently, would rather live for the moment, satisfy the moment, live for the moment, and try to establish a storyline that Republicans are intent on obstructing President Obama's judicial nominees. That storyline is patently ridiculous in light of the facts, an utterly absurd suggestion in light of the facts. Before this current Democratic gambit to fill up the D.C. Circuit one way or the other, the Senate had confirmed 215 of the president's judicial nominees and rejected 2. That's a 99% confirmation rate. 215 confirmed and 2 rejected. 99%. Look, if advising consent is to mean anything at all, occasionally consent is not given. But by any objective standard, Senate Republicans have been very, very fair to this president. We've been willing to confirm his nominees. In fact, speaking of the D.C. Circuit, we just confirmed one a few months ago, 97-0 to the D.C. Circuit. So I suggest our colleagues take a time out, stop trying to jam us, work with us instead to confirm vacancies that actually need to be filled, which we have been doing. This rules change charade has gone from being a biennial threat to an annual threat, now to a quarterly threat. How many times have we been threatened, my colleagues? Do what I say, or we'll break the rules to change the rules. Confirm everybody. 100%. Anything less than that is obstructionism. That's what they're saying to effect. Well, let me say, we're not interested in having a gun put to our head any longer. If you think this is in the best interest of the United States Senate and the American people to make advise and consent in effect mean nothing, obviously you can break the rules to change the rules to achieve that. But some of us have been around here long enough to know the shoe is sometimes on the other foot. This strategy of distract, distract, distract is getting old. I don't think the American people are fooled about this. If our colleagues want to work with us to fill judicial vacancies like we've been doing all year, 99% of judges confirmed, obviously we're willing to do that. If you want to play games, set yet another precedent that you'll no doubt come to regret. Say to my friends on the other side of the aisle, you'll regret this, and you may regret it a lot sooner than you think. Let me be clear. The Democratic playbook of broken promises, double standards, and raw power, the same playbook that got us Obamacare, has to end. It may take the American people to end it, but it has to end. That's why Republicans are going to keep their focus where it belongs, on the concerns of the American people. It means we're going to keep pushing to get back to the drawing board on health care, to replace Obamacare with real reforms that do not punish the middle class, and we'll leave the political games to our friends on the other side of the aisle.
The Majority Leader.
What is the business before the Senate right now?
Motion to proceed to S-1356.
The business before the Senate is the motion to proceed to S-1356.
I move now, Mr. President, proceed to the motion to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not included on the Millett nomination.
The question is on the motion to proceed. The yeas and nays have been requested. Clerk will call the roll. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk.
The nays are ordered.
The yeas and nays are ordered.
The clerk will call the roll.
Clerk will call the roll.
There is a sufficient second.
We've ruled there is a sufficient second. The yeas and nays have been ordered. The clerk can call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
Thank you.
Wonderful else they got.
Let me hit the warning. Huh?
Nothing.
For me, it's early. Ms. Shelby. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. I got you. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Menendez.
Circuit, this is the motion to reconsider. Yes.
Senators voting in the affirmative. Baldwin.
We have order in the Senate, so the clerk can be heard. Go ahead.
Senators voting in the affirmative. Baldwin, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, Wicker, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative. Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Moran? No.
On this vote, we have order, please. On this vote, there are 57 yeas, 40 nays, and 3 responded present. The Majority Leader.
I move to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not invoked on the Millett nomination.
The question is on the motion. The Republican Leader.
Parliamentary inquiry.
The Republican Leader will state the parliamentary inquiry.
Is it correct that more than 200 judicial nominations have been confirmed by the Senate since 2009?
The chair is informed the Secretary of the Senate affirmed that more than 200 judicial nominations have been confirmed since 2009.
Mr. President, further parliamentary inquiry. Is it correct that under the bipartisan streamlining provisions of S.Res. 116 and S. 679 in the 112th Congress, the Senate removed 169 nominations from Senate consideration completely move 272 nominations to the Senate's expedited calendar, and remove from Senate consideration approximately 3,000 nominations for the NOAA Officer Corps and the Public Health Service.
It is the understanding of the Chair that pursuant to S. Res. 116 and S. 679 of the 112th Congress, a large number of nominations were moved to a newly created expedited consideration process or removed from the advice and consent process of the Senate altogether. The Chair cannot confirm the exact number.
Mr. President, I move to adjourn the Senate until 5 p.m. and ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The question is on the motion. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer.
All right. I'm sorry. Thank you. I was trying to figure out escape for a while.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran.
One of those is supposed to nominate.
Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez,
I can tell you.
Okay, yes.
Mr. Merkley,
That are pending.
Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions,
All right.
Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, Manchin, McCain, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Grassley, aye.
Aye.
Mr. Johans, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Coates, aye. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. McConnell, aye.